Good morning. My name is Agnieszka Bloch, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our discussion titled French Elections 2022, Implications for Europe's Future and Place in the World at the Wilson Center. Yesterday, incumbent President of France, Emmanuel Macron, defeated his far-right challenger Marine Le Pen of the National Rally, 58.5 to 41.5% in the race for the French presidency. While this is another resounding victory for Macron at 58.5%, we should remember that the margin of victory is almost half what it was 5 years ago. Macron has put the task of strengthening Europe's power, sovereignty, and independence at the core of his first mandate. From his Sorbonne speech in 2017 to recent addresses to the European Parliament amid the war in Ukraine, he has never ceased to tie France's future to the fate of Europe. In many ways, it is the central pitch that he has been making to the French people since his first campaign. So I think it's fair to say that it wasn't a huge surprise to see in the final weeks of this election that he sought to frame the battle between himself and Marine Le Pen as a referendum on Europe. Le Pen, meanwhile, didn't explicitly push for a Frexit in this campaign, a withdrawal from the European Union on the model of Brexit, but many agree that her proposals for Europe would effectively dismantle the Union as it exists today and halt any further deepening of the EU, let alone enlargement, which is of course top of mind for us today as the war in Ukraine continues to rage. So today I want us to dig into a few main themes and questions. Firstly, I want us to talk about what these results tell us about France and the state of French politics today. Secondly, I want to ask what Emmanuel Macron's record is today, what lessons he's learned, and how we might see some of these lessons implemented in a second term. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the main challenges facing Macron in this second mandate, both domestic and international, and how these might constrain some of his ambitions. So I'm delighted to be joined today by a distinguished group of experts on France and Europe to answer these questions. I'm going to introduce you in the order in which you're sitting next to me. Bill Drozdiak is a Global Fellow in the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, and he is the author of The Last President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive France and Save the World. Célia Belin is a visiting fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings and an expert on transatlantic relations, U.S. foreign policy toward Europe, and French politics and foreign policy. Stephen Philip Kramer is also a Global Fellow in the Wilson Center's Global Europe program and a historian of modern and contemporary Europe with an emphasis on France. Before we begin our discussion, I just want to take a moment to thank Jason Moyer and Teresa Ida and their colleagues at the Wilson Center for all their work in making this event possible. So for our discussion, let's start with some high-level takeaways from the election, some takeaways that you have from yesterday's results. I'm going to go down the line this way, so let's start with Bill.
Well, I think yesterday's result was an affirmation of the axiom that the French in the first round vote with their hearts and in the second round vote with their heads. I think a lot of French voters, despite the polls that said the race would be much closer, went into the voting booths and asked themselves, do I really want to entrust the governance of France over the next 5 years to Marine Le Pen? And if they gave careful consideration to Emmanuel Macron's record, they would realize it wasn't as bad as it sounds. He is unloved, he is arrogant, he is glacial, and for a lot of reasons, he has not connected with the French population. But I believe he's had a very creditable record. France has the lowest unemployment rate in more than 10 years. It's the fastest growing economy in Europe. 78% of the population is vaccinated, in contrast to the other countries like Britain and Germany. So I think he's had overall, he's steered the country through these crises, the economic crisis, the pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine, where he made a valiant, if failed, effort to mediate an end to the war.
Célia? And feel free to disagree with each other or respond.
Thank you, Agnieszka, and thank you to the Wilson Center. This is a very fun way to debrief yesterday's result. fresh this morning. So as Bill said, it was not that surprising that in the second round the French voters would go back to really evaluating both candidates' merits. And as we said over the past 2 weeks, Marine Le Pen's incompetence and radical platform really turned off a whole lot of people. She did do better than 2017. She did have 2 million more votes than in 2017, up to 13 million votes, while Emmanuel Macron lost 2 million votes, from 20 million to close to 18 million votes this time around. But what sits in the middle of these two numbers is the number of abstention plus a blank vote that were expressed, which was up to 16 million votes. So you have about a third of French voters who just refuse to go to the polls. You have the classic abstention of every time people are just not interested in politics. But clearly, this is a very high number, highest in I believe decades. That expresses this sort of disillusionment, as well as, fundamentally the conviction that Emmanuel Macron was bound to be re-elected because of his superiority in terms of competence, probably, and because you still have a sort of fundamental rejection of the far right. So for all of these reasons, you have a result today that lacks the sort of momentum that usually you get after a presidential election for Emmanuel Macron. He is validated probably through his re-election with a mandate to just continue the work. Clearly, that's what the French have said. But no honeymoon is to be expected at all. He will be facing a political opposition from day one. And this will necessarily prove more difficult in terms of the type of reform he might want to implement. And I want to point out that within 2 months, you will have parliamentary elections in June. Maybe we can go back on this. So the political moment is not over. That's really the main impression the day after, is that this is just not over. The head of state stays in place, Emmanuel Macron is re-elected, but politics continue.
Stephen?
Well, I feel an enormous relief at the results of the election. Historians often see things after the fact based on inevitability. But if you put yourself back 2 weeks ago with the relatively close election on the first round, there was nothing inevitable about Macron being re-elected. And I think that friends I know, myself, were really worried it could have gone the other way. It could have gone the other way. And what does that mean when one of the two most important democracies in Europe could have elected an extremist of the right, who would have undone the European Union and done her best to undo NATO, and who until a month or two before was best friends with Putin? So I think it was very scary. And despite Macron's victory, it's important to take into account that he's going to face potentially big problems. He had a difficult first term. We almost have forgotten the Gilets jaunes. They're still there. Mm-hmm. The discontent in French countryside and small towns is still very great. It's going to be very difficult for Macron to finally find a way of appealing to those people. It used to be said in the good old days of the Third Republic that Frenchmen had their heart on the left and their pocketbook on the right. I don't think they have their heart on the left anymore. A lot of them had their heart on the right and maybe their pocketbook in the center. That's very scary. And we can talk about that later.
I'd definitely like to come back to that. And I think all of you have touched on things that I want to come back to. Celia, you talked about abstention. I'd like to go into that a little bit. Abstention among voters aged 18 to 24 already in the first round was over 40%. In the second round, it again exceeded 40%. Young people are among those who are most disillusioned with Macron and with the French political landscape writ large, and I think this goes to a lot of what you're saying, Stephen. Nonetheless, yesterday, as Macron was walking to the Champ de Mars to give his victory speech, he was surrounded by young people. and was clearly trying to convey that young people would be at the center of his second term, and along with that, some of the priorities of young people. So, Celia, I would like to ask you, what do you think Macron will try to do to convince these younger voters that he actually does have their interests in mind? Because, of course, we saw that Marine Le Pen was really trying to appeal to these younger voters and succeeded in many ways. So what will he do to convince young voters that he is working for them? And what specifically, since climate is so top of mind for many younger voters, what will he try to do on climate, both at the domestic and the European level?
So indeed, there was this moment of contrast when he walked to give his acceptance speech yesterday and surrounded by a lot of people. This was an echo to his motto, nous tous, all together, for the second round. And the first round's motto was avec vous, with you, something like with you all, right? And even on the pictures, the campaign pictures, you had Macron with a lot of shadow figures behind him. The idea here is not just young people, but it was also that Macron has been criticized for being a Jupiterian president, an isolated president that exercised a vertical power and does not get close to people and has been getting poor polling on that front. Is Macron close to my everyday preoccupation? He gets half of the points that Marine Le Pen had. On that particular front. So really for him to go on with people, and in particular young people, was a way to sort of redress this impression. On the merits of what he might do now, of course the press, and I am also the first one to say that, has focused on the idea that he needs to do more in climate action. Climate is one of the top preoccupations of young people, and he has a lot to deliver on this. We can go back maybe what's the actual plan on this front. And he has said, not only during the debate, during his between the two rounds, that he would start an ambitious agenda of ecological planification. He has said yesterday night in his acceptance speech that he wanted to make France a great ecological nation. So this is very present. But we should not sort of forget the fact that there are other elements of discontent very high among the young people. These people have gone through the COVID crisis, which has entailed numerous lockdowns, and in particular a lot of suffering for university students, for isolation and alienation, for not having classes, down to actual very rapid increase in poverty among students. We've seen students lining up to get food in food banks because they were so impoverished for the lack of, they could not have their little extra day job or something to make ends meet. And I think this sort of youth that has been deprived of joy, and then the difficulty for the government to answer that particular crisis, all of these reasons, and you should not also forget high level of enthusiasm for the far right among the young people. So it's a combination of all of this that has explained the higher numbers of abstention among the young people. And yes, Emmanuel Macron is the youngest French president, but he has not translated this very much in a pro-young people policies in any way, shape or form. He really needs to do better on this for the second term.
Absolutely. And Marine Le Pen really has. It seemed like that was such a focus of her program and of her campaign. And we can also talk about Mélenchon, who also has higher numbers of support among younger people.
Just
Sure.
clarification. I think it's in terms of context. In 2020, we in the United States had a record turnout, more than a century, of 66% of the voters. France had the lowest turnout that it's had, and it was still 72%. So you have to recognize the fact that participation there is stronger. But as Celia was saying, he faces a fractured landscape. 57% of French voters went for the far left or the far right in the first round. And that's going to be hard for him to reconcile.
Right, absolutely. And then 35%, as Celia mentioned, abstained or voted null or blank. That's also a huge portion of the electorate. Stephen, I want to talk about another group in France that has rejected in many ways both Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. I know that you're working on a book at the moment titled Jews, Muslims, and the French Republic on the situation of Muslims in France, which you compare with the development of the French Jewish community. Well, in 2017, a majority of Muslims in France voted for various left candidates. 70% in the first round this year voted for the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. For many French Muslims then, the decision in the second round came down to Marine Le Pen, who despite this surface level rebrand that has been widely covered in the press and that we can talk about, continues to place anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant policies at the core of her program. On the other hand was Emmanuel Macron, whose government in the first term pushed proposals that many Muslims in France saw as harmful. In particular, and maybe you can tell us more about this, we'll remember that he pushed forward an anti-separatism law, giving the government greater power over religious establishments, schools, and other groups, and the law was heavily criticized from international and national human rights organizations, especially after its adoption for closing 718 mosques, Muslim schools, and associations for encouraging separatism. So I want to ask you, Stephen, how, if at all, do you expect Macron to reach out to French Muslim communities who are particularly disillusioned and angry at the current state of French politics and voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round?
That's a very, very good question. It seems to me that Macron, at the beginning of his first term, had aroused significant expectations on the part of some enlightened and pro-laic Muslim leaders. Something was going to be done to deal with the situation of Muslims. It didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. And then towards the end of his term, as the elections were approaching, Macron gave a famous speech at Moreau. And this speech was a typical Macron speech, on the one hand, on the other hand, recognizing all the problems that French Muslims faced in terms of discrimination, being stuck in the banlieue and the Grand Projet and so on, and then talking about the need to take action against Muslim separatism. What followed was in no way addressing these big issues of discrimination and inequality, but putting emphasis on tough legislation, allegedly tough legislation, to deal with separatism and insecurity, although it was never clear that there was any more violence in French society now than there was before. And the separatism, ill-defined, referred to a very small number of Islamists. It was, I think, fairly appalling. Things had been suggested by people in official milieu, the Bourlou plan to try to deal with the banlieue, rejected by Macron. He appointed Bourlou to draw it up. And if there's a wonderful document by Jacques Toubon, the Défenseur des droits. Toubon is a center-right politician who came from the Chirac days. And it's an incredible document. It outlines the kinds of discrimination that French Muslims face that's almost been totally ignored. Macron's main goal was to preempt the right from taking advantage of the issues of insecurity and the fear of Muslims. As a result, he in no way fought back against some of this kind of stuff into the very, very end. So when Marine Le Pen talked about how a face scarf was an Islamist costume, like it was female Amazon warriors, fighting against the very essence of France. That finally Macron basically said, no, this kind of thing can lead to civil war. But it's partly because Macron didn't resist this, and because the center-right, by God, Valérie Pécresse, who accepted the notion of the great separation, a great replacement. It's unbelievable that this could come from the center-right. That's one reason that she probably lost so badly. To take Renaud Camus' crazy idea and give it legitimacy. But Macron didn't do very much. Yeah. So will he turn around and change and do something, whatever that might be?
And would it be convincing?
Remains to be seen. Likewise, he began with a great emphasis on ecology, and then that all disappeared with Hulot's resignation. Yeah. So I think Macron have to make a convincing effort to deal with some of these issues. It scares me profoundly, as someone who's a historian, at the rise of the far right. And a good friend of mine, Joseph Convitz, who I hope is listening to this in Paris, said, the election, was about personality, not about ideology. People who voted for Le Pen didn't necessarily vote for her because of her ideas. But remember one thing, in 2002, her father got 18% because people rejected, his extremism. Mm-hmm. They were willing to put up with her extremism, perhaps, because they didn't like Macron. So many French people were willing to vote for Le Pen. That already means that all the taboos against the far right have been breached, and that is really, really worrisome.
Absolutely.
Do we, can I ask a question? Do we have the numbers? I don't think we've seen them yet for Muslims this time around, right?
Not
correct.
Yet. I looked this one.
Because I really wonder, after voting 70% for Mélenchon, how they, did they abstain a lot? I think a lot mobilized. There was a conversation, which, we've discussed this before, among Muslim communities, people of color communities in France over who should we vote for. I mean, should we abstain or vote Macron, because the Le Pen vote was, of course, out of the question. And part of the most progressive side would say that not going to vote for Macron was a white privilege. So basically you had to, you had to go and vote for Macron. So I really wonder what those numbers will turn out to be.
I do too. I want to change topics a little bit and come back to Bill. Of the three candidates who received over 20% of the vote in the second round, Macron, Marine Le Pen, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, Macron was the only staunchly pro-European and pro-NATO candidate, even though, as we know, he's criticized NATO in the past. And while neither Mélenchon nor Marine Le Pen explicitly advocate a Frexit, they're both very critical of the European Union, and many, in fact, have argued that Marine Le Pen effectively did want a Frexit. So we should remember, meanwhile, that Mélenchon has advocated leaving NATO, which he's described recently as a useless organization that causes tensions. Marine Le Pen used to want France to, and still does want France to leave NATO's integrated command. I'm thinking about the cleavage that this creates in French politics between a pro-European camp that Macron is one of the few people who really stands out in, even though the socialist Anne Hidalgo and the Green Yannick Jadot have followed him in many ways in that, but he's really the only central person in that camp. And then on the other hand, on both the far right and the far left, a strong anti-EU and anti-NATO camp. Bill, do you think that this is going to continue to be the defining cleavage in French politics and maybe even in European politics during and after another Macron term? And do you think this will outlive Macron's time as president of France, this divide?
Right. Well, I already think that the left-right cleavage has been replaced by pro-Europe, open society, liberal international order versus the closed nationalistic approach embodied by Marine Le Pen and her supporters, and others in Europe, such as Viktor Orban, who was recently re-elected to a fourth term in Hungary. And next year there'll be a very important election in Italy, where Matteo Salvini hopes to get into power. So I think much of Macron's second term will be focused on Europe and trying to mobilize other European countries as well as France to stand up for its own interests in an era of resurgent big power rivalry, United States, Russia, China. And he really fears, and he told this to me in several conversations we had for my book, that unless Europe stands up and defends its own interests, becomes a more sovereign entity vis-a-vis the other powers, it risks disappearing as a political project. And I think what you will see is that he will try to tackle some of these big issues that confront France in a European context. For example, Celia mentioned the ecology green issues. Already the European Union pandemic fund to replace is 750 billion euros is earmarked for green energy and new growth projects. And I think you will see Macron try to steer other leaders in the direction of making Europe the world leader in green technologies. It already is in some respects, but I think there will be a new push in this regard. Spain is already doing that, has set a goal of 2/3 of its energy output from renewables by 2026. And when you look at the crisis faced by Germany over the supply of oil and gas from Russia, this becomes all the more acute for the European Union. And Macron is betting a lot on France's leadership in terms of nuclear energy. And if you talk to climate experts, they say the only way we can reduce carbon emissions in a serious way is to make a bet on nuclear energy. And this is where France has leadership. He's already approved 6 new nuclear energy centers. So I think this will be a big focus of his attention, and making Europe stronger in terms of providing, taking more responsibility for its own security and defense is something that should be welcomed in the United States, and certainly by the Biden administration, which has been sort of standoffish about this, like other previous administrations, because it feared the loss of American leadership. I think it should be welcomed in the sense that the United States faces an existential challenge of its leadership from China, and if the U.S. is going to focus on that, it needs to have France and Europe stand up in defense of its own security interests more and more, so that the U.S. can focus on other challenges.
Stephen, go ahead.
I think that probably everyone in this panel and almost everybody in the Washington policy community was really pleased that Macron was elected. And for us, I guess, the most important thing that's happening today is the Ukraine crisis. It seems fairly obvious that of major candidates, Macron was the only one who seemed to take a reasonable position in protecting Ukraine and saw the dangers of what Russia was doing. I mean, certainly Le Pen didn't, and Mélenchon didn't. But I think that what's striking is how little the Ukraine issue and the issues that Bill is talking about played in the French election itself. I mean, people didn't seem to care all that much on the whole about international politics and Ukraine. It seems to me that what's hitting France is what's hitting so many countries in the world, including the United States, and that is the country is dividing not between left and right, as you've all said, but between those people who see the forces of globalization and technological change as being beneficial to them, and those people who are terrified, by that. It's the old France versus the new. It's the urban areas versus the rural areas. And the problem is, and of course, in our own election, in the Trump election, that kind of factor played a very important role. So the difficulty is, first of all, finding policies that make a difference to people who are on the other side in an age of transition. How do you talk to them? How do you talk to the quote-unquote deplorables? That's the most difficult thing. How do you give them a sense that there's something to hope for, that things that were best about France in the past can be retained in a somewhat different way? I think that's absolutely crucial. And that's where Macron will have to really try hard. I was thinking during this campaign that I wish there was a guy who had Macron's ideas and Jacques Chirac's charm. Jacques Chirac knew how to talk to anybody. He went to ENA. He was not, from the people, but he knew how to address the people. Macron has far better ideas than Jacques Chirac ever did. but he has to find the intuition and the empathy that you need to get across to ordinary people. They can't. They are half of France. That's going to be his biggest challenge. A good program, but also finding a way of understanding ordinary people.
Right.
On that front, remember that Macron was never elected to any office before being elected president of France.
Right.
So he lacks this sort of local grounding that Jacques Chirac, obviously, but also François Hollande, even Nicolas Sarkozy, even though it was in a richer sort of neighborhood of Paris, had this sort of underground connection that he doesn't have. And then when he came in, created his own party and was very successful in the parliamentary election, he also invited a whole lot of new people that did not necessarily held elected office. Some of them did, but not a big chunk of them. And so even during those 5 years, he did not necessarily get the sort of feedback that you need from the ground, this discontent in this part of the country, etc. That made potentially, he was an sort of excellent president of crises, but not necessarily a president that was responsive to what was happening, and it bubbled through in the Yellow Vest protest with this discontent that came out. So I think what your point is extremely valid.
Right, and as Celia points out, he was a neophyte, never held elected office before, and when he came in, he was confronted with a new age of polarization, as we've seen in our country, and the same in France, and how vicious it was. I remember at one point, 2 years into his presidency, I had a conversation with him, and I asked, what surprised you the most about your first 2 years as president? And he leaned back in his chair for about 10 seconds, thought, and he said, la haine, the hatred. And he says, it's one thing to disagree with my policies, it's another thing to string me up in effigy and attack my car and call me a son of a whore and that sort of thing. But he was really taken aback by that, the viciousness of politics. And as we see in our own country.
That kind of brings me to a bigger question that I have for all three of you, which is, what are the lessons that you think he has learned? He's been president of France for 5 years. There's been enormous blowback in the form of the Gilets jaunes and others. He has been a good crisis manager, and he's dealt with many, many crises by this point. But what are the lessons? And maybe we can just go down the line and see. What are the lessons, and what do you think he would do differently and might do differently?
I think he does realize he needs to show greater empathy and understanding for people. His wife is somebody who constantly reminds him of that. She seems to be more conscious of his arrogant image and his need to redress that. And I think he's late in the campaign. He's tried to do that, but it'll be hard for him to shake the image that he acquired early in his campaign as president of the rich, and that he is not somebody who will ever be considered a man of the people. But I think, again, I revert back to my earlier comments, I think he will be more and more of a foreign policy president, particularly if he doesn't achieve any kind of legislative majority support in the parliamentary elections in June. I think he will revert to being somebody who really devotes his energies to Europe and the international stage and less at home, because he will realize that his domestic program would be paralyzed by his opponents.
Well, we should come back to whether his domestic program would be paralyzed by his opponents. I'm curious. And this is also making me think of the Biden administration's foreign policy for the middle class and whether that's something that Macron could learn from. But Celia, I want to ask you the same questions. What are the lessons that he's learned, but maybe sharpen it, because you've talked about Macron as an impatient pragmatist. So maybe tell us what you mean by that and whether you think there are lessons for him that have been learned from that approach.
No, I was trying to also think about what Bill just said, which is very interesting. Would he actually go towards the natural place of a president, which is in foreign policy, right? In particular, if he's more constrained politically on the domestic front. But Emmanuel Macron is omnipresent, and he's also extremely ambitious. It's hard for me to see him really sort of hover over what's happening and take distance and allow sort of others to call up the shots of the domestic politics, because that's not his type. So and also when you were talking about how he needs to fight against his image, the image is pretty set in terms of arrogance or distance or something, but it's also going against his own nature. If you remember, in December, he gave a big interview to TF1 where he presented a sort of mea culpa, I'm sorry about some words that I've had in the past that might have hurt some people. And I think, and he was reflecting on it, and he said, you know, I think I've learned to respect the voters more, the French more, I want to make a presidency of benevolence. I think he might have sincerely thought that, but 2 weeks later, talking about the vaccination campaign and the imposition of the vaccine pass, he said, oh, I want to piss off the unvaccinated, that's my goal. The exact opposite of what he just said. And again, yes.
But it worked. More and more French got vaccinated.
Yeah, but so he has an instinct that his instinct, I would say, is not Joe Biden's instinct. It's not an instinct of unifying the country. It's an instinct of action and dividing the country potentially if it serves a bigger purpose, like driving the wedge and really, you know, putting clear what's at stake here, and you're in one camp or the other. That's how he sort of makes it work. And that's also part of the discontent. So I don't know if he's going to be able to just go against this nature of him. And to go to your point on the fact, yes, I call him an impatient pragmatist, in particular in foreign policy. Impatient because clearly we've seen him, tackle every issue on every front at every point. He not only dealt with Europe, but also with Russia, also with the Middle East. He got interested in Africa. He did climate. He did everything, sometimes at the cost of not following through very much. But he's also a pragmatist because he's pro-European, pro-NATO, but, he was also trying at the time to really, work with Russia and Putin. He also got close to Donald Trump. So he's a bit everywhere, doing everything at every point. That, again, I think it's his fundamental nature. I don't see him going back on any of these methods. He will just continue on. And so there is a risk that he's made all these promises now of unifying the country, of probably tackling some of the domestic elements, but his nature is just what we've seen in the past 5 years. It might just continue.
He's now faced with a foreign policy crisis that's having very acute effects domestically. So maybe we can talk about how his vision of Europe and how to translate Europe's importance on the domestic stage has changed because of the war in Ukraine.
Well, I'd like to just go back
ahead.
to your original question because you asked what has Macron learned?
Yes.
What we don't know.
True.
What we know is what we think he should have learned. And so the wisdom of this panel is one thing, and Emmanuel Macron is something else. I hope he adopts some of the ideas that my colleagues have mentioned. I think that one thing he could do to obviate his tendency to take charge of everything is to really devolve power more into strong ministers. You need and he can do that in terms of a prime minister because he's not running again. And everybody in the Fifth Republic is worried that if you appoint a strong prime minister, that person can challenge you the next election, as Edouard Philippe might have. So now he's not running again. A strong prime minister. It's one thing that is hard to do in the Fifth Republic, but can make a very, very big difference. He talked about giving the prime minister authority over the environmental issues. It's a very, very good idea. You need to have strong ministers in areas like education and health, Because after all, COVID proved a lot of the problems, that many problems exist in the French health system, though he recovered pretty well from that. And education has been a source of enormous unhappiness, and that's one of the reasons that so many students are really angry and young people are angry. So good ministers, ministers who can develop a program, and ministers who have the kind of personality which is more open to dialoguing with constituencies, and show more intuition and empathy for people, those would be very good things. He has plenty to do in terms of the big picture, and he certainly has plenty to do in terms of foreign and international policy. Now, let's face it, you can't really have a grand foreign policy until the Ukraine issue is settled, and who knows how long, settled in a good way. Who knows how that can happen, how long that can take place. That's what really is going to matter. So I think he's going to have to focus on that. And I think there he's played an outstanding job. He's tried to provide Putin with an off-ramp. It's not going to take place, apparently, as far as we can see. But that's the number one thing. And after that, dealing with the broader issues of European and Atlantic security. And I think he's very well qualified to do that. And I don't think he can be faulted very much. So a good prime minister who can help to deal with domestic issues, he can sort of take charge of foreign policy. But I think it's very important also to find a way of telling the French people where he hopes the country's going to go. Mm-hmm. What's the positive story? What's the future that they can look forward to? That's critical. What is it? How does it all fit together? Right. What does it mean? And if you could sort of talk to people in a personal way, he has done very little in terms of speaking to the French public, just like our president has not done that very much. And one shouldn't underestimate the value of periodic speeches in which you sort of explain what you're trying to do and get people on your side. I hope Macron does more of that.
He really needs to refute these narratives of decline. I mean, that's very popular among.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, in terms of a choice of prime minister, traditionally, we've seen in other presidents like Francois Mitterrand, Jacques Chirac, they chose their prime minister to use it as a shield to deflect criticism. And while they focused on big picture issues, as Celia points out rightly, he can't help himself. He wants to be so enmeshed in the details of everything that he wants to be his own prime minister. And he's got to learn not to do that. But I think, and as Stephen mentioned, he needs to inspire the French people to recognize that they have a pretty good life. I mean, there's universal health care. When I go there as an American visitor and journalist and author probing into the issues dealing with France, and I see how well people live, I'm reminded of the phrase by a French writer, Sylvain Tesson, who said, France is a paradise inhabited by people who think they're in hell. And unfortunately, if a president can say, come on, and rally the people and saying, we're better than this, we're capable of greater things, and building on our strengths, I think that will help him make a success of his second term.
If I may, on that point, you're right, Bill, that the French are overly critical always of their leaders, and clearly, the way Macron's record was criticized tends to think that we only see the negative. There was no, effort to really perceive the positive, and part of the positive was really that a huge part of this president with his government took France, through terrible crises, in particular the pandemic crisis, in a really good way, and dealt with very important decisions. One of them was keeping kids in school. The other one was imposing the digital health pass. I think those two were really brave leadership decisions that really made a difference in tackling this crisis, up to the vaccination campaign. But there is a reality in France that you have increasing inequalities and you have kind of two France. And the two France are the ones that have been expressed this time around. The ones, there's a very strong correlation between in poll numbers when people are asked, do you think your personal life is going well? And you say yes, and they voted for Macron. Do you believe your personal life is going badly? And if you say yes, you are more likely to vote for Le Pen. So and it's not just perception. There's a reality. There's a higher number of poor people. You have diminishing purchasing power, increased cost of living. All of these realities doesn't mean that they live, in my opinion, as badly as some of the poor people in this country, which on top of everything don't necessarily have healthcare or a good education around the corner. But still, you do have very strong difficulties, in particular in rural France, in peri-urban France, so everything that is around the city but not as connected, because you have a lack of mobility, you have departure of public services, you have basically a concentration of everything that works well within cities and everything that doesn't work as well outside. This is one of the fractures that really this government needs to tackle and just accept as a big fracture and tackle. And it includes the banlieue, the places where communities of color or Muslim communities tend to be stuck in and with a higher difficulty to get out of. These places, there was the Plan Borloo, there have been initiatives, and Macron has failed to deliver on that front. He needs to tackle that one and also how to take rural France on board with the growth and with the country that goes well. It's very, very hard. There's no question that it's not difficult. But just stating it as one priority would be good to hear.
Yeah. But as you say, the rural population suffers badly from high energy costs.
Really.
And this is where, if he has an enlightened European program, this could benefit France in dealing with the social fracture that they have at home.
150 years ago, Benjamin Disraeli wrote about the two Englands. And he was writing at a time when the Industrial Revolution had divided the country profoundly. So now we're in a kind of post-industrial period, post-industrial revolution. And France, like other countries, is divided. It seems to me that for Macron to succeed, he has to have two things. One is a real program that can deal with that. But then it's indispensable, as Disraeli realized, to have a mystique. You have to have a belief that people share that things are going to work out, that there's a way out of the present dilemma, that there's a happy future. He has to transmit that as well.
I want to stay on this, the challenges that Macron will face in the second term. You joked before, Stephen, that we've almost forgotten about the Gilets jaunes. French people certainly haven't forgotten about the Gilets jaunes, and I think it's possible that given the domestic effects of the war that I was alluding to before, this is something that could continue to take on increasing importance. So what do you think, and I want to direct this to you, but feel free to jump in as you've been, what do you think that Macron will face in terms of challenges? Do you think there'll be social and political unrest? Will we see a new version of the Gilets jaunes?
Well, that's a really great question, but it's impossible to answer. First of all, things don't tend to repeat themselves in the same kind of way. So it's very easy to say, yes, we may have another Gilets jaunes uprising, but I doubt whether it would take the same form. I think it's just sufficient to realize that you have to find a way of talking to the people who are unhappy and give them some sense that there is a future for them, and to make it clear that that doesn't mean sacrificing all the things that are meaningful. But then you have to deal with, you have to have intelligent policies, and you have to think about their impact on people. For example, if there's a problem of people getting to work because they live far away, you can't cut out train service, local train service. You have to think about those things. You have to show how ecological change, could be positive for their lives. It's a very tough thing to do. I mean, but that's what the art of governing is,
The Yellow Vest movement, the Gilets jaunes, erupted because of the frustrations that boiled over because Macron and his party, La République En Marche, had total domination of the political. And so there was no outlet for opposition in the political sphere, so they took to the streets. And France has a well-honed tradition for taking vengeance on politicians by going to the streets. So I think a lot will depend on who becomes the major party. He will certainly not have that kind of domination by his own party after the parliamentary elections. There will be probably strong far left, strong right. Don't see the socialists or the center-right Gaullists who ended up with only less than 6% total. These are the traditional establishment parties that have been completely demolished. And so how, and this fractured landscape, the far left and the far right interact, and who emerges in June as an important political force will, I think, affect the reaction in the streets, and whether or not there will be another Gilets jaunes, or whether it'll be a civil war, an eruption in the banlieue by the immigrant offspring who are frustrated by their inability to climb the social ladder.
So you made a really important point that I want to go one step further. I mean, France had a robust party system in the Fifth Republic, 2 big parties and smaller parties. It now seems to have no political parties. I mean, the socialists may exist on regional levels, so may the Républicains, but they may be able to send people to parliament. National Front's never been good at getting people elected, and La République En Marche is not really a political party, and who knows what it's going to elect. We have a France without a political party system, and the parties are what transmitted people's frustrations, as did the trade unions, which are relatively ineffective. So, I mean, the end of the traditional party system without the existence of the new one, I think that also creates potential problem, because if people are annoyed, how do they show, who represents them? And that's why it's Gilets jaunes, or going to the street, becomes more of a real possibility, and that is worrisome.
On that front, exactly as you pointed out, you have a party system that has exploded since 2017, clearly, and a weakening of mainstream parties. But again, this second round of presidential election, the re-election of Macron, did not close the political time. The political time, if anything, will be wide open at least until the legislative elections on June 12 and 19, because Macron will seek a majority for governing, and because leaders in particular on the left that have decided to support Macron in the second round have promised the beginning of a big political fight. The motto was, let's elect him and let's fight him immediately. You vote for Macron out of a rejection of Marine Le Pen, and you immediately start organizing in order to defeat him. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has been defeated but was the third man of the first round, is already positioning himself to be prime minister, which is not the way French politics work, but in an effort to animate a Union Populaire, a popular union behind him. And you already seen yesterday night there was some green officials, leaders and socialist leaders coming and sort of defending the Mélenchon idea. So something is cooking there that they might just, for the first time, and people have asked them to unite for the past year, please unite for the presidential election. They were unable to. They might just unite for this time around, because maybe the egos are not as strong, and they've also, the Greens and the Socialists, in particular the Socialists, have suffered badly in the presidential election. They might just unite. I have a question for Bill, if I may.
Go ahead.
Bill, I remember from your book, you followed Emmanuel Macron in Nouvelle-Calédonie, New Caledonia. The results in all the overseas departments and territories are staggering in both rounds. The first round, they voted, if I'm not mistaken, 70% for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. This time around, extremely high abstention, but 70% for Marine Le Pen. What's up with that? Do you have any instinct on what's going on with the relationship either between, it's Macron and the overseas territories and departments, but maybe it's France, continental France, and its overseas departments?
I think there is a sense of alienation in the overseas departments in French Polynesia and New Caledonia, of neglect by metropolitan France, and they see the events in France and they feel they're not being helped. Now, it's ironic that the submarine sale that Macron's government made to Australia was supposed to be the foundation of a new Indo-Pacific strategy by France that was going to enable them to have more of a presence, because 2 million French citizens live in the Indo-Pacific area. But that was, of course, sabotaged by the Biden administration when they went in and basically undermined the sale so that they could sell their own and that accounts, I think, for the fury and outrage that was felt by Macron and his fellow ministers about this, because it wasn't just the loss of a 50 billion euro submarine deal, which is, of course, very significant in terms of jobs and the defense industry for France. But it was also undermining and sabotaging a policy that they hoped would alleviate a lot of the unrest and anguish felt by these people in New Caledonia and French Polynesia. And I was out there and I saw that they grumble all the time. They're saying, nobody cares about us, and we're sort of in limbo. So the independence movement didn't go anywhere because they realized they can't really care for themselves sufficiently. So it's a difficult position, and frankly, the outcome, the voting results, as you outlined, did not surprise me at all.
We're just about running out of time, so I want to give you each an opportunity to just say a few last words. I'm going to start with Stephen. I'm going to reverse the order. And then, Celia, since you specifically work on France-U.S. relations, and Bill mentioned AUKUS, which I was hoping we would come to, if there's anything in particular that you can tell us that we might be able to expect, because the Biden-Macron relationship is something that I think has been rocky, including because of AUKUS, but maybe you have some insight into what might be coming. But let's just do last words, about a minute each, starting with Stephen.
Well, I want to just reiterate my profound sense of relief. And my sense also of how precarious national politics are in all of the great democracies. Macron's victory was not inevitable. Italy, a short time ago, was at the point of disaster of a Salvini becoming prime minister. And then, like in an 18th century comedy, you have this deus ex machina, and a minor character reemerges, Conte, and then a great man comes in, Draghi, and suddenly Italy becomes a paragon. It's always very close these days. Democracy, I think, is in danger because it can't always deal effectively with the incredible questions that are raised by the transition to new forms of. And then there's the environment, and there's climate change, which gets very little attention. Most of the time, it's always preempted by. And yet it's the biggest problem that we face. And then the problem of dealing with Russia. I mean, for all of us in our generation, we thought finally that was over. The Cold War was over. World wasn't perfect, but my God, it was a lot better than it was. It's not anymore. And so I think Macron, all the leaders in democratic nations face a terrifically difficult time. And I'm glad that he's back in office and can lead France.
Celia?
I share the sentiment of Stephen very much, even though I'm reminded that Marine Le Pen does 41% of the vote, and even if a large chunk of her platform is despicable, there are some elements there that lack any form of representation. Because of our system, including at the parliamentary election, we always end up with extremely few MPs coming from the Front National, the Rassemblement National now, or any other more marginal groups, but in particular the nationalist right. It's not that I hope for them, it's just that at some point you need a conduit for these voices to get expressed, or they end up radicalizing and increasingly get frustrated. So there's something that, you know, Macron has promised some institutional reform. I think that's one of the big elements that he needs to focus on, along with everything else we said. So it's just a bit too much. I agree. As far as French-American relations are concerned, probably big sigh of relief for the Biden administration, even though it hasn't been as productive a relationship. We know of the AUKUS deal and the disputes between France and the US. But since then, you've had a real effort of consultation between France and the US to work on strategic affairs, to work on Asia, but also to work very closely on Russia. So situation is much better. Now I think it's time for a sort of second wave after this sort of reconciliation, for really finding a common agenda on two fronts, one a clear and two that are clear Biden priorities. One is climate action, clearly. The other one is also democracy. You know, with so far the French have been a little bit unsure on the Summit for Democracy and democracy versus authoritarian play. They have different views, but they should continue to work together and share on this front. And of course, Russia, Ukraine. That's just the massive element that will dominate the conversation. But I think a productive relationship is around the corner. There's no reason why not, at least as long as Joe Biden is president.
Yes. Well, I certainly hope Celia is right, because we need in our country to recognize the fact that France right now, I think, is our most important ally in Europe. It's a member of the Permanent Security Council. It is the dominant military power in continental Europe, and the military cooperation between the United States and France has been excellent in places like Africa and the Middle East. And I think the challenges in the future will be even stronger. It was unfortunate. It was a big mistake by the Biden administration to leave France out of its Indo-Pacific strategy, because after all, France has 5 military bases in the Indo-Pacific area. It has 2 million citizens. And there's a lot that France could contribute in terms of a coordinated Indo-Pacific strategy. But most important of all, I think, in the second term will be Emmanuel Macron's effort to construct a new security order for Europe. And however the war in Ukraine ends up, something has to be done about Russia. And it's hard to imagine anything being accomplished while Vladimir Putin is in power. But nonetheless, a country as large as Russia, with 9 time zones, so many rich natural resources, oil and gas supplies that would be a natural complement to the European economy. Something needs to be addressed there, and Macron has been doing a lot of thinking about that, I think, and wants some way to, I think that accounts for the conversations he's had with Putin. He told me at one point, I believe we have to persuade Putin not to embrace China and turn back toward Europe, and I'm confident he will do so because he's the son of St. Petersburg. And I said, well, isn't he rather a son of the KGB? And, but he said, no, that's why he's persisted with these conversations. He's had 17 conversations or so in the first 3 months of this year with Putin. Most of them, by the way, instigated by Putin. So he clearly wanted to keep this dialogue going. But France, under a second Macron term, will be absolutely vital to achieving a stable European security order in the future.
Well, with that, I want to thank all three of you, Stephen, Sidya, and Bill, for this excellent conversation. And I want to also thank our viewers who were watching online. So thank you. And I think we're adjourned.